in the way of a singer who was beginning a song. The piano tuned and insisted, but when Bernice began to speak, her dark gold voice rang in the kitchen, and they did not listen to the piano notes. But to start this morning, Bernice began with the old same story that they had heard many times before, the story of her and Ludi Freeman, a long time ago. Now, I am here to tell you I was happy. There was no human woman in all the world more happy than I was in them days, she said, and that includes everybody. You listening to me, John Henry? It includes all queens and millionaires and first ladies of the land, and I mean it includes people of all color. You hear me, Frankie? No human woman in all the world was happier than Bernice Sadie Brown. She had started with the old story of Ludi, and it began an afternoon in late October almost 20 years ago. The story started at the place where first they met each other, in front of Camp Campbell's filling station, outside of the city limits of the town. It was the time of the year when the leaves were turning, and the countryside was smoky and autumn gray and gold. And the story went on from that first meeting to the wedding at the Welcome Ascension Church in Sugarville. And then on through the years with the two of them together, the house with the brick front steps and the glass windows on the corner of Barrow Street, the Christmas of the fox fur, and the June of the fish fry thrown for 28 invited relatives and guests. The years with Bernice cooking dinner and sewing Ludi's suits and shirts on the machine, and the two of them always having a good time. And the 9 months they lived up north in the city of Cincinnati, where there was snow. Then Sugarville again, and days merging one into another, and the weeks, the months, the years together. And the pair of them always had a good time. Yet it was not so much the happenings she mentioned as the way she told about these happenings that made F. Jasmine understand. Bernice spoke in an unwinding kind of voice, and she had said that she was happier than a queen. As she told the story, it seemed to F. Jasmine that Bernice resembled a strange queen, if a queen can be colored and sitting at a kitchen table. She unwound the story of her and Ludi like a colored queen unwinding a bolt of cloth of gold. And at the end, when the story was over, her expression was always the same, the dark eyes staring straight ahead, her flat nose widened and trembling, her mouth finished and sad and quiet. As a rule, when the story was over, they would sit for a moment and then suddenly get busy doing something in a hurry. Start a hand of cards or make milkshakes or just stir around the kitchen with no particular purpose. But this afternoon, they did not move or speak for a long time after Bernice had finished, until finally F. Jasmine asked, "What exactly did Ludi die of?" "It was something similar to pneumonia," said Bernice. "November, the year 1931. "The very year and the very month I was born," F. Jasmine said. "The coldest November I ever seen. Every morning there was frost and puddles were crusted with ice. The sunshine was pale yellow like it was in winter time. Sounds carried far away, and I remember a hound dog that used to howl towards sundown. I kept a fire in the hearth going day and night, and in the evening when I walked around the room, there was this shaking shadow following alongside of me on the wall. And everything I seen come to me as a kind of sign." "I think it's a kind of sign I was born the same year and the same month he died," F. Jasmine said. "Only the dates are different." And then it was a Thursday towards 6 o'clock in the afternoon, about this time of day, only November. I remember I went to the passage and opened the front door. We were living in that year at 233 Prince Street. Dark was coming on, and the old hound was howling far away. And I go back in the room and lay down on Ludi's bed. I lay myself down over Ludi with my arms spread out and my face on his face, and I pray that the Lord would contage my strength to him. And I asked the Lord, let it be anybody, but not let it be Ludi. And I lay there and prayed for a long time until night. How? John Henry asked. It was a question that did not mean anything, but he repeated it in a higher, wailing voice. How, Bernice? That night he died, she said. She spoke in a sharp tone as though they had disputed with her. I tell you he died, Ludi. Ludi Freeman, Ludi Maxwell Freeman died. She was finished, and they sat there at the table. Nobody moved. John Henry stared at Bernice, and the fly that had been hovering above him lighted on the left rim of his glasses. The fly walked slowly across the left lens, and over the nosepiece, and across the right lens. It was only when the fly had flown away that John Henry blinked and waved his hand. One thing, F. Jasmine said finally. There's Uncle Charles laying there dead right now, yet somehow I can't cry. I know I ought to feel sad, yet I feel sadder about Ludi than I do about Uncle Charles, although I never laid eyes on Ludi. And I knew Uncle Charles all my life, and he was blood kin to blood kin of mine. Maybe it's because I was born so soon after Ludi died. Maybe so, said Bernice. It seemed to F. Jasmine that they might just sit there the rest of the afternoon, without moving or speaking, when suddenly she remembered something. You were starting out to tell a different story, she said. It was some kind of warning. Bernice looked puzzled for a moment. Then she jerked her head up and said, Oh, yes. I was going to tell you about this thing we was talking about applies to me and what happened with them other husbands. Now, you perk up your ears. But the story of the other three husbands was an old story also. As Bernice began to talk, F. Jasmine went to the refrigerator and brought back to the table some sweetened condensed milk to pour on crackers as a dessert. At first she did not listen very carefully. It was the April of the following year that I went one Sunday to the Fork Falls Church. And you all asked what I was doing out there, and I tell you, I was visiting that Jackson branch of my foster cousin who live out there, and we had gone to their church. So there I was, praying in this church when the congregation was strangers to me. I had my forehead down on the top of the pew in front of me, and my eyes were open, not gazing round in secret, mind you, but just open, when suddenly this shiver run all the way through me. I had caught sight of something from the corner of my eye, and I looked slowly to the left. And guess what I seen there? There on the pew, just 6 inches from my eye, was this thumb. What thumb? F. Jasmine asked. Now I'm telling you, said Bernice. To understand this, you have to know that there was only one little portion of Ludi Freeman which was not pretty. Every other part about him was handsome and pretty as anyone would ever wish, all except his right thumb, which had been mashed in a hinge. This one thumb had a mashed, chewed appearance that was not pretty. You understand? You mean you suddenly saw Ludi's thumb when you were praying? I mean I seen this thumb, and as I kneeled there, a shiver run from my head to my heels. I just kneeled there, staring at this thumb. And before I looked any further to find out whose thumb it might be, I begun to pray in earnest. I prayed out loud, Lord, manifest, Lord, manifest. And did he? F. Jasmine asked. Manifest? Bernice turned aside and made a sound like spitting. Manifest my foot, she said. You know who that thumb belonged to? Who? Why, Jamie Beale, said Bernice. That big old no-good Jamie Beale. It was the first time I ever laid eyes on him. Is that why you married him? F. Jasmine asked. For Jamie Beale was the name of the sorry old liquor drinker who was the second husband. Because he had a mashed thumb like Ludy's? Jesus knows, said Bernice. I don't. I felt drawn to him on account of the thumb. And then one thing led to another. First thing I knew, I'd married him. Well, I think that was silly, F. Jasmine said, to marry him just because of that thumb. Me too, said Bernice. I'm not trying to dispute with you. I'm just telling you what happened. The very same thing occurred in the case of Henry Johnson. Henry Johnson was the third husband, the one who had gone crazy on Bernice. He was all right for 3 weeks after they had married, but then he went crazy, and he behaved in such a crazy way that finally she had to quit him. You mean to sit there and tell me Henry Johnson had one of those mashed thumbs too? No, said Bernice. It was not the thumb that time. It was the coat. F. Jasmine and John Henry looked at each other, for what she was saying did not seem to make much sense. But Bernice's dark eye was sober and certain, and she nodded to them in a definite way. To understand this, you have to know what happened after Ludy died. He had a policy due to pay off $250. I won't go into the whole business, but what happened was that I was cheated by them policy people out of $50. And in 2 days, I had to scour around and raise the $50 to make out for the funeral. Because I couldn't let Ludy be put away cheap, I pawned everything I could lay my hands on, and I sold my coat and Ludy's coat to that second-hand clothing store on Front Avenue. Oh, if Jasmine said, then you mean Henry Johnson bought Ludy's coat and you married him because of it? Not exactly, said Bernice. I was walking down that street alongside of the city hall one evening when I suddenly seen this shape before me. Now, the shape of this boy ahead of me was so similar to Ludy through the shoulders and the back of the head that I almost dropped dead there on the sidewalk. I followed and run behind him. It was Henry Johnson, and that was the first time I ever saw him also, since he lived in the country and didn't come much into town. But he had chanced to buy Ludy's coat, and he was built on the same shape as Ludy. And from the back view, it looked like he was Ludy's ghost, or Ludy's twin. But how I married him, I don't exactly know, for to begin with, it was clear that he did not have his share of sense. But you let a boy hang around you, and you get fond of him, and anyway, that's how I married Henry Johnson. People certainly do curious things. You telling me, said Bernice. She glanced at F. Jasmine, who was pouring a slow ribbon of condensed milk over a soda cracker to finish her dinner with a sweet sandwich. I swear, Frankie, I believe you got a tapeworm. I'm perfectly serious. Your father looks over them big grocery bills and is naturally suspicious that I carry things off. You do, F. Jasmine said, sometimes. He reads over them grocery bills and he complains to me. Bernice, what in the name of holy creation did we do with 6 cans of condensed milk and 11 dozen eggs and 8 boxes of marshmallows in 1 week? And I have to admit to him, Frankie, I have to say to him, Mr. Adams, you think you're feeding something human back here in your kitchen? That what you think. I have to say to him, yes, you imagine it as something human. After today, I'm not going to be greedy anymore, F. Jasmine said. But I don't understand the point of what you was telling. I don't see how that about Jamie Beale and Henry Johnson applies to me. It applies to everybody, and it is a warning. But how? Why, don't you see what I was doing? Asked Bernice. I loved Ludy, and he was the first man I loved. Therefore, I had to go and copy myself forever afterward. What I did was to marry off little pieces of Ludy whenever I come across them. It was just my misfortune they all turned out to be the wrong pieces. My intention was to repeat me and Ludy. Now don't you see? I see what you're driving at, F. Jasmine said, but I don't see how it is a warning applied to me. Then do I have to tell you? Asked Bernice. F. Jasmine did not nod or answer, for she felt that Bernice had laid a trap for her and was going to make remarks she did not want to hear. Bernice stopped to light herself another cigarette, and two blue, slow scrolls of smoke came from her nostrils and lazed above the dirty dishes on the table. Mr. Schwarzenbaum was playing an arpeggio. F. Jasmine waited, and it seemed a long time. You and that wedding at Winter Hill, Bernice said finally. That is what I'm warning you about. I can see right through them two gray eyes of yours like they was glass. And what I see is the saddest piece of foolishness I ever knew. Gray eyes is glass, John Henry whispered. But F. Jasmine would not let herself be seen through and outstared. She hardened and tensed her eyes and did not look away from Bernice. I see what you have in your mind. Don't think I don't. You see something unheard of at Winter Hill tomorrow, and you ride in the center. You think you're going to march down the center of the aisle, right in between your brother and the bride. You think you're going to break into that wedding, and then Jesus knows what else. No, F. Jasmine said. I don't see myself walking down the center of the aisle between them. I see through them eyes, said Bernice. Don't argue with me. John Henry said again, but softer, Gray eyes is glass. But what I'm warning is this, said Bernice. If you start out falling in love with some unheard of thing like that, what is going to happen to you? If you take a mania like this, it won't be the last time, and of that you can't be sure. So what will become of you? Will you be trying to break into weddings the rest of your days? And what kind of life would that be? It makes me sick to listen at people who don't have any sense, F. Jasmine said, and she put her two fingers in her ears, but she did not push in the fingers very tight, and she could still hear Bernice. You're just laying yourself this fancy trap to catch yourself in trouble, Bernice went on, and you know it. You've been through the B section of the 7th grade, and you are already 12 years old. F. Jasmine did not speak of the wedding, but her argument passed over it, and she said, They will take me. You wait and see. And when they don't, I told you, F. Jasmine said, I will shoot myself with Papa's pistol. But they will take me, and we're never coming back to this part of the country again. Well, I've been trying to reason seriously, said Bernice, but I see it is no use. You determined to suffer. Who said I was going to suffer? F. Jasmine said. I know you, said Bernice. You will suffer. You are just jealous, F. Jasmine said. You are just trying to deprive me of all the pleasure of leaving town and kill the joy of it. I'm just trying to head this off, said Bernice. But I see it is no use. John Henry whispered for the last time, Gray eyes is glass. It was past 6 o'clock, and the slow, old afternoon began slowly to die. F. Jasmine took her fingers from her ears and breathed a long, tired sigh. When she had sighed, John Henry sighed also, and Bernice concluded with the longest sigh of all. Mr. Schwarzenbaum had played a ragged little waltz, but the piano was not yet tuned to suit him, and he began to harp and insist on another note. Again he played the scale up until the 7th note, and again he stuck there and did not finish. F. Jasmine was no longer watching the music with her eyes. But John Henry was watching, and when the piano stuck on the last note, F. Jasmine could see him harden his behind and sit there stiff in the chair, his eyes raised, waiting. It is that last note, F. Jasmine said. If you start with A and go on up to G, There is a curious thing that seems to make the difference between G and A all the difference in the world. Twice as much difference as between any other two notes in the scale, yet they are side by side there on the piano just as close together as the other notes. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, 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 ti. It could drive you wild. John Henry was grinning with his snaggled teeth and giggling softly. Tee, tee, he said, and he pulled up Bernice's sleeve. Did you hear what Frankie said? Tee, tee. Shut your trap, F. Jasmine said. Quit always being so evil-minded. She got up from the table, but she did not know where to go. You didn't say anything about Willis Rhodes. Did he have a mashed thumb or a coat or something? Lord, said Bernice, and her voice was so sudden and shocked that F. Jasmine turned and went back to the table. Now that is a story that would make the hair rise on your head. You mean to say I never told you about what happened with me and Willis Rhodes? No, F. Jasmine said. Willis Rhodes was the last and the worst of the four husbands, and he was so terrible that Bernice had had to call the law on him. What? Well, imagine this, said Bernice. Imagine a cold, bitter January night, and me laying all by myself in the big parlor bed, alone in the house, because everybody else had gone for the Saturday night to Forks Falls. Me, mind you, who hates to sleep in an empty old bed all by myself and is nervous in a house alone. Past 12 o'clock on this cold, bitter January night. Can you remember winter time, John Henry? John Henry nodded. Now, imagine this, said Bernice again. She had begun stacking the dishes so that 3 dirty plates were piled before her on the table. Her dark eyes circled around the table, roping in F. Jasmine and John Henry as her audience. F. Jasmine leaned forward, her mouth open and her hands holding the table edge. John Henry shivered down in his chair, and he watched Bernice through his glasses without batting his eyes. Bernice had started in a low and creepy voice. Then suddenly she stopped and sat there looking at the two of them. So what? F. Jasmine urged, leaning closer across the table. What happened? But Bernice did not speak. She looked from one of them to the other and shook her head slowly. Then when she spoke again, her voice was completely changed, and she said, Why, I wish you would look yonder. I wish you would look. F. Jasmine glanced quickly behind her, but there was only the stove, the wall, the empty stair. What? She asked. What happened? I wish you would look, Bernice repeated. Them 2 little pictures and them 4 big ears. She got up suddenly from the table. Come on, let's wash the dishes. Then we're going to make some cupcakes to take tomorrow for the trip. There was nothing F. Jasmine could do to show Bernice how she felt. After a long time, when the table before her was already cleared, and Bernice stood washing dishes at the sink, she only said, If it's anything I mortally despise, it's a person who starts out to tell something and works up people's interest and then stops. I admit it, said Bernice, and I am sorry, but it was just one of them things I suddenly realized I couldn't tell you and John Henry. John Henry was skipping and scuttling back and forth across the kitchen from the stairway to the back porch. Cupcakes, he sang. Cupcakes, cupcakes. You could have sent him out of the room, F. Jasmine said, and told me. But don't think I care. I don't care a particle what happened. I just wish Willis Rhodes had come in about that time and slit your throat. That is an ugly way to talk, said Bernice, especially since I got a surprise for you. Go out on the back porch and look in the wicker basket covered with the newspaper. F. Jasmine got up, but grudgingly, and she walked in a crippled way to the back porch. Then she stood in the doorway holding the pink organdy dress. Contrary to all that Bernice had maintained, the collar was pleated with tiny little pleats, as it was meant to be. She must have done it before dinner when F. Jasmine was upstairs. "Well, this is mighty nice of you," she said. "I appreciate it." She would have liked for her expression to be split into two parts so that one eye stared at Bernice in an accusing way and the other eye thanked her with a grateful look. But the human face does not divide like this, and the two expressions canceled each other out. "Cheer up," said Bernice. "Who can tell what will happen? You might dress up in that fresh pink dress tomorrow and meet the cutest little white boy in Winter Hill you ever seen. It's just on such trips as these that you run into beaux." "But that's not what I'm talking about," F. Jasmine said. Then, after a while, still leaning against the doorway, she added, "Somehow we got off on the wrong kind of conversation." The twilight was white, and it lasted for a long while. Time in August could be divided into four parts: morning, afternoon, twilight, and dark. At twilight, the sky became a curious blue-green, which soon faded to white. The air was soft gray, and the arbor and trees were slowly darkening. It was the hour when sparrows gathered and whirled above the rooftops of the town, and when in the darkened elms along the street there was the August sound of the cicadas. Noises at twilight had a blurred sound, and they lingered: the slam of a screen door down the street, voices of children, the whir of a lawn-mower from a yard somewhere. F. Jasmine brought in the evening newspaper, and dark was coming in the kitchen. The corners in the room at first were dark, then the drawings on the wall faded. The three of them watched the dark come on in silence. "The army is now in Paris." "That's good." They were quiet a while, and then F. Jasmine said, "I have a lot of things to do. I ought to start out now." But although she stood ready in the doorway, she did not go. On this last evening, the last time with the three of them together in the kitchen, she felt there was some final thing she ought to say or do before she went away. For many months she had been ready to leave this kitchen, never to return again. But now that the time had come, she stood there with her head and shoulder leaning against the door jamb, somehow unready. It was the darkening hour when the remarks they had made had a sad and a beautiful sound, although there would be nothing sad or beautiful about the meaning of the words. F. Jasmine said quietly, "I intend to take 2 baths tonight. One long soaking bath and scrub with a brush. I'm going to try to scrape this brown crust off my elbows, then let out the dirty water and take a second bath." "That's a good idea," said Bernice. "I will be glad to see you clean." "I'll take another bath," John Henry said. His voice was thin and sad. She could not see him in the darkening room since he stood in the corner by the stove. At 7, Bernice had bathed him and dressed him in his shorts again. She heard him shuffle carefully across the room, for after the bath he had put on Bernice's hat and was trying to walk in Bernice's high-heeled shoes. Again he asked a question which by itself meant nothing. "Why?" he asked. "Why what, baby?" said Bernice. He did not answer, and it was F. Jasmine who finally said, "Why is it against the law to change your name?" Bernice sat in a chair against the pale white light of the window. She held the newspaper open before her, and her head was twisted down and to one side as she strained to see what was printed there. When F. Jasmine spoke, she folded the paper and put it away on the table. "You can figure that out," she said. "Just because. Think of the confusion." "I don't see why," F. Jasmine said. "What is that on your neck?" said Bernice. "I thought it was a head you carried on that neck. Just think, suppose I would suddenly up and call myself Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, and you would begin naming yourself Joe Louis, and John Henry would try to pass off as Henry Ford. Now, what kind of confusion do you think that would cause?" Don't talk childish, F. Jasmine said. That is not the kind of changing I mean. I mean from a name that doesn't suit you to a name you prefer. Like I changed from Frankie to F. Jasmine. But still it would be a confusion, Bernice insisted. Suppose we all suddenly changed to entirely different names. Nobody would ever know who anybody was talking about. The whole world would go crazy. I don't see. Because things accumulate around your name, said Bernice. You have a name, and one thing after another happens to you, and you behave in various ways and do things so that soon the name begins to have a meaning. Things have accumulated around the name. If it's bad and you have a bad reputation, then you just can't jump out of your name and escape like that. And if it's good and you have a good reputation, then you should be content and satisfied. But what had accumulated around my own name? F. Jasmine asked. Then, when Bernice did not reply at once, F. Jasmine answered her own question. Nothing. See? My name just didn't mean anything. Well, that's not exactly so, said Bernice. People think of Frankie Adams, and it brings to mind that Frankie is finished with the B section of the seventh grade. And Frankie found the golden egg at the Baptist Easter hunt, and Frankie lives on Grove Street, and... But those things are nothing, F. Jasmine said. See? They're not worthwhile. Nothing ever happened to me. But it will, said Bernice. Things will happen. What? F. Jasmine asked. Bernice sighed and reached for the Chesterfield package inside her bosom. You pin me down like that, and I can't tell you truthfully. If I could, I would be a wizard. I wouldn't be sitting here in this kitchen right now, but making a fine living on Wall Street as a wizard. All I can say is that things will happen. Just what? I don't know. By the way, F. Jasmine said after a while, I thought I would go around to your house and see Big Mama. I don't believe in those fortunes or anything like that, but I thought I might as well. Suit yourself. However, I don't think it's necessary. I suppose I ought to leave now, F. Jasmine said. But still she waited in the darkening door and did not go away. The sounds of the summer twilight crossed within the silence of the kitchen. Mr. Schwarzenbaum had finished tuning the piano, and for the past quarter of an hour he had been playing little pieces. He played music memorized by note, and he was a nervous, spry old man who reminded F. Jasmine of a silver spider. His music was spry and stiff also, and he played faint, jerking waltzes and nervous lullabies. Further down the block, a solemn radio announced something they could not hear. In the O'Neill's backyard next door, children were calling and swatting a ball. The sounds of evening canceled out each other, and they were faded in the darkening twilight air. The kitchen itself was very quiet. Listen, F. Jasmine said. What I've been trying to say is this. Doesn't it strike you as strange that I am I and you are you? I am F. Jasmine Adams, and you are Bernice Sadie Brown, and we can look at each other and touch each other and stay together year in and year out in the same room. Yet, always, I am I, and you are you, and I can't ever be anything else but me, and you can't ever be anything else but you. Have you ever thought of that? And does it seem to you strange? Bernice had been rocking slightly in the chair. She was not sitting in a rocking chair, but she had been tilting back in the straight chair, then letting the front legs hit the floor with little taps. Her dark, stiff hand held to the table edge for balance. She stopped rocking herself when F. Jasmine spoke, and finally she said, I have thought of it occasionally. It was the hour when the shapes in the kitchen darkened and voices bloomed. They spoke softly, and their voices bloomed like flowers. If sounds can be like flowers and voices bloom. F. Jasmine stood with her hands clasped behind her head, facing the darkening room. She had the feeling that unknown words were in her throat, and she was ready to speak them. Strange words were flowering in her throat, and now was the time for her to name them. This, she said, I see a green tree, and to me it is green, and you would call the tree green also, and we would agree on this. But is the color you see as green the same color I see as green? Or say we both call a color black. But how do we know that what you see as black is the same color I see as black? Bernice said after a moment, those things we just cannot prove. F. Jasmine scraped her head against the door and put her hand up to her throat. Her voice shattered and died. That's not what I meant to say anyway. The smoke of Bernice's cigarette lay bitter and warm and stagnant in the room. John Henry shuffled in the high-heeled shoes from the stove to the table and back again. A rat rattled behind the wall. This is what I mean, F. Jasmine said. You are walking down a street, and you meet somebody, anybody, and you look at each other, and you are you, and he is him. Yet, when you look at each other, the eyes make a connection. Then you go off one way, and he goes off another way. You go off into different parts of town, and maybe you never see each other again. Not in your whole life. Do you see what I mean? Not exactly, said Bernice. I'm talking about this town, F. Jasmine said in a higher voice. There are all these people here I don't even know by sight or name, and we pass alongside each other and don't have any connection. And they don't know me, and I don't know them. And now I'm leaving town, and there are all these people I will never know. But who do you want to know? Asked Bernice. F. Jasmine answered, everybody in the world. Everybody in the world. Why, I wish you would listen to that, said Bernice. How about people like Willis Rhodes? How about them Germans, them Japanese? F. Jasmine knocked her head against the door jamb and looked up at the dark ceiling. Her voice broke, and again she said, that's not what I mean. That's not what I'm talking about. Well, what is you talking about? Asked Bernice. F. Jasmine shook her head almost as though she did not know. Her heart was dark and silent, and from her heart the unknown words flowered and bloomed, and she waited to name them. From next door there was the evening sound of children's baseball and the long call, batter up, batter up. Then the hollow pock of a ball and the clatter of a thrown bat and running footsteps and wild voices. The window was a rectangle of pale, clear light, and a child ran across the yard and under the dark arbor after the ball. The child was quick as a shadow, and F. Jasmine did not see his face. His white shirt tails flapped loose behind him like queer wings. Beyond the window the twilight was lasting and pale and still. Let's play out, Frankie, John Henry whispered. They sound like they're having a mighty good time. No, F. Jasmine said. You go. Bernice stirred in her chair and said, I suppose we could turn on the light. But they did not turn on the light. F. Jasmine felt the unsaid words stick in her throat, and a choked sickness made her groan and knock her head against the door jamb. Finally, she said again in a high, ragged voice, this. Bernice waited, and when she did not speak again, she asked, what on earth is wrong with you? F. Jasmine could not speak the unknown words, so after a minute she knocked her head a last time on the door and then began to walk around the kitchen table. She walked in a stiff-legged, delicate way, as she felt sick and did not wish to joggle the different foods that she had eaten and mix them up inside her stomach. She began to talk in a high, fast voice, but they were the wrong words and not what she'd meant to say. Boy, oh man, man, oh boy, she said. When we leave Winter Hill, we're going to more places than you ever thought about or even knew existed. Just where we will go first, I don't know, and it don't matter, because after we go to that place, we're going on to another. We mean to keep moving, the three of us, here today and gone tomorrow. Alaska, China, Iceland, South America, traveling on trains, letting her rip on motorcycles, flying around all over the world in airplanes, here today and gone tomorrow, all over the world. It's the damn truth, boy, oh man. F. Jasmine jerked open the drawer of the table and fumbled inside for the butcher knife. She did not need the butcher knife, but she wanted something to grasp in her hand and wave about as she hurried around the table. And talking of things happening, she said, things will happen so fast we won't hardly have time to realize them. Captain Jarvis Adams sinks 12 Jap battleships and decorated by the President. Miss F. Jasmine Adams breaks all records. Mrs. Janice Adams elected Miss United Nations in beauty contest. One thing after another happening so fast we don't hardly notice them. Hold still, fool, said Bernice, and lay down that knife. And we will meet them, everybody. We will just walk up to people and know them right away. We will be walking down a dark road and see a lighted house and knock on the door, and strangers will rush to meet us and say, come in, come in. We will know decorated aviators and New York people and movie stars. We will have thousands of friends, thousands and thousands and thousands of friends. We will belong to so many clubs that we can't even keep track of all of them. We will be members of the whole world, boy, oh man, man, oh boy. Bernice had a very strong, long right arm, and when F. Jasmine passed her the next time as she was running around the table, this arm reached out and snatched her by the petticoat so quickly that she was caught up with a jerk that made her bones crack and her teeth rattle. Is you gone raving wild? She asked. The long arm pulled F. Jasmine closer and wrapped around her waist. You sweating like a mule. Lean down and let me feel your forehead. You got a fever? F. Jasmine pulled one of Bernice's plates and pretended she was going to saw it off with the knife. You trembling, said Bernice. I truly believe you took a fever walking around in that sun today. Baby, you sure you ain't sick? Sick? Asked F. Jasmine. Who, me? Sit here in my lap, said Bernice, and rest a minute. F. Jasmine put the knife on the table and settled down on Bernice's lap. She leaned back and put her face against Bernice's neck. Her face was sweaty, and Bernice's neck was sweaty also, and they both smelled salty and sour and sharp. Her right leg was flung across Bernice's knee, and it was trembling. But when she steadied her toes on the floor, her leg did not tremble any more. John Henry shuffled toward them in the high-heeled shoes and crowded up jealous and close to Bernice. He put his arm around Bernice's head and held on to her ear. Then, after a moment, he tried to push F. Jasmine out of her lap, and he pinched F. Jasmine with a mean and tiny little pinch. Leave Frankie alone, said Bernice. She ain't bothering you. He made a fretting sound. I'm sick. Now, no, you ain't. Be quiet and don't grudge your cousin a little bit of love. Old mean bossy Frankie, he complained in a high, sad voice. What's she doing so mean right now? She just laying here, wore out. F. Jasmine rolled her head and rested her face against Bernice's shoulder. She could feel Bernice's soft, big ninnas against her back, and her soft, wide stomach, her warm, solid legs. She had been breathing very fast, but after a minute her breath slowed down so that she breathed in time with Bernice. The two of them were close together as one body, and Bernice's stiffened hands were clasped around F. Jasmine's chest. Their backs were to the window, and before them the kitchen was now almost dark. It was Bernice who finally sighed and started the conclusion of that last queer conversation. I have a vague idea what you were driving at, she said. We all of us somehow caught. We born this way or that way, and we don't know why, but we caught anyhow. I born Bernice, you born Frankie, John Henry born John Henry, and maybe we wants to widen and bust free, but no matter what we do, we still caught. Me is me, and you is you, and he is he. We each one of us somehow caught all by ourselves. Is that what you're trying to say? I don't know, F. Jasmine said, but I don't want to be caught. Me neither, said Bernice. Don't none of us. I'm caught worse than you is. F. Jasmine understood why she had said this, and it was John Henry who asked in his child voice, Why? Because I am black, said Bernice, because I am colored. Everybody is caught one way or another, but they done drawn completely extra bounds around all colored people. They done squeezed us off in one corner by ourselves. So we caught that first way I was telling you, as all human beings is caught, and we caught as colored people also. Sometimes a boy like Honey feel like he just can't breathe no more. He feel like he gotta break something or break himself. Sometimes it's just about more than we can stand. I know it, F. Jasmine said. I wish Honey could do something. He just feels desperate like. Yes, F. Jasmine said. Sometimes I feel like I want to break something too. I feel like I wish I could just tear down the whole town. So I've heard you mention, said Bernice, but that won't help none. The point is that we all caught, and we try in one way or another to widen ourselves free. For instance, me and Ludi. When I was with Ludi, I didn't feel so caught. But then Ludi died. We go around trying one thing or another, but we caught anyhow. The conversation made F. Jasmine almost afraid. She lay there close to Bernice, and they were breathing very slowly. She could not see John Henry, but she could feel him. He had climbed up on the back rungs of the chair and was hugging Bernice's head. He was holding her ears. For in a moment Bernice said, Candy, don't retch my ears like that. Me and Frankie ain't going to float up through the ceiling and leave you. Water dropped slowly in the kitchen sink, and the rat was knocking behind the wall. I believe I realize what you were saying, F. Jasmine said. Yet, at the same time, you almost might use the word loose instead of caught, although there are two opposite words. I mean, you walk around and you see all the people, and to me they look loose. Wild, you mean? Oh, no, she said. I mean, you don't see what joins them up together. You don't know where they all came from or where they're going to. For instance, what made anybody ever come to this town in the first place? Where did all these people come from? And what are they going to do? Think of all those soldiers. They were born, said Bernice, and they're going to die. F. Jasmine's voice was thin and high. I know, she said, but what is it all about? People loose and at the same time caught. Caught and loose. All these people, and you don't know what joins them up. There's bound to be some sort of reason and connection. Yet somehow I can't seem to name it. I don't know. If you did, you would be God, said Bernice. Didn't you know that? Maybe so. We just know so much. Then beyond that, we don't know no more. I wish I did. Her back leg was cramped, and she stirred and stretched herself on Bernice's lap, her long legs sprawling out beneath the kitchen table. Anyway, after we leave Winter Hill, I won't have to worry about things anymore. You don't have to now. Nobody requires you to solve the riddles of the world. Bernice took a deep, meaning breath and said, "Frankie, you got the sharpest set of human bones I ever felt." This was a strong hint for F. Jasmine to stand up. She would turn on the light and take one of the cupcakes from the stove and go out to finish her business in the town. But for a moment longer, she lay there with her face pressed close to Bernice's shoulder. The sounds of the summer evening were mingled and long drawn. "I never did say what I was talking about," she said finally. "But there's this. I wonder if you have ever thought about this. Here we are, right now, this very minute, now. But while we were talking right now, this minute is passing, and it will never come again, never in all the world. When it is gone, it is gone. No power on earth could bring it back again. It is gone. Have you ever thought about that?" Bernice did not answer, and the kitchen was now dark. The three of them sat silent, close together, and they could feel and hear each other's breaths. Then suddenly it started, though why and how they did not know. The three of them began to cry. They started at exactly the same moment, in the way that often on these summer evenings they would suddenly start a song. Often in the dark, that August, they would all at once begin to sing a Christmas carol or a song like the Slip Belly Blues. Sometimes they knew in advance that they would sing, and they would agree on the tune among themselves. Or again, they would disagree and start off on three different songs at once, until at last the tunes began to merge and they sang a special music that the three of them made up together. John Henry sang in a high, wailing voice, and no matter what he named his tune, it sounded always just the same. One high, trembling note that hung like a musical ceiling over the rest of the song. Bernice's voice was dark and definite and deep, and she rapped the off-beats with her heel. The old Frankie sang up and down the middle space between John Henry and Bernice, so that their three voices were joined and the parts of the song were woven together. Often they would sing like this, and their tunes were sweet and queer in the August kitchen after it was dark. But never before had they suddenly begun to cry, and though their reasons were three different reasons, yet they started at the same instant as though they had agreed together. John Henry was crying because he was jealous, though later he tried to say he cried because of the rat behind the wall. Bernice was crying because of their talk about colored people, or because of Ludi, or perhaps because F. Jasmine's bones were really sharp. F. Jasmine did not know why she cried, but the reason she named was the crew cut and the fact that her elbows were so rusty. They cried in the dark for about a minute. Then they stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The unaccustomed sound had quieted the rat behind the wall. "Get up from there," said Bernice. They stood around the kitchen table, and F. Jasmine turned on the light. Bernice scratched her head and sniffled a little. "We certainly is a gloomy crowd. Now I wonder what started that." The light was sudden and sharp after the darkness. F. Jasmine ran the faucet of the sink and put her head beneath the stream of water, and Bernice wiped off her face with a dish rag and patted her plates before the mirror. John Henry stood like a little old woman dwarf, wearing the pink hat with the plume and the high-heeled shoes. The walls of the kitchen were crazy drawn and very bright. The three of them blinked at each other in the light as though they were three strangers or three ghosts. Then the front door opened, and F. Jasmine heard her father trudging slowly down the hall. Already the moths were at the window, flattening their wings against the screen, and the final kitchen afternoon was over at last.